At 7:55 a.m., on a quiet Sunday in paradise, the sky over Pearl Harbor was torn open. A surprise attack by the Empire of Japan left 2,403 Americans dead, crippled the U.S. Pacific Fleet, and plunged the United States into World War II. For decades, the story was one of shock, a bolt from the blue, unprovoked act of aggression. But what if the attack wasn't a surprise at all? What if it was the final desperate move in a conflict building for decades? This is the story of why Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. It's a story where the first shots weren't fired from planes, but from economic policies. This wasn't just a military decision. It was the last gamble of a nation pushed to the brink, a story that begins not in 1941, but almost a century earlier, with a nation's ambition to build an empire, and the one fatal flaw that would lead it straight to war. To understand December 7th, we can't start in 1941. We have to go back to the mid-19th century. For 200 years, Japan had been in self-imposed isolation, deliberately cut off from the world. Then, in 1853, everything changed. American Commodore Matthew Perry sailed his heavily armed black ships into Edo Bay, forcing Japan to open its ports. This was a profound shock. The Japanese saw the overwhelming military might of the West and realized their isolation had left them dangerously vulnerable. What followed was the Meiji Restoration of 1868, one of history's most radical transformations. The old feudal shogunate was replaced, and power was restored to the emperor. Under the slogan "Rich Country, Strong Army," Japan launched a furious campaign of modernization, adopting Western technology and industry. A modern army was created, railways were built, and factories shot up. In just a few decades, Japan transformed from a feudal society into an industrial power. But this new Japan had a massive, unavoidable problem. It's an island nation with a severe lack of natural resources. It has almost no oil, iron ore, rubber, or other raw materials needed to run an industrial economy and a modern military. As Japan's industry grew, its hunger for resources spiraled out of control. Japan's leaders looked at the Western powers, Britain, France, the United States, and drew a simple conclusion. To be great, you needed an empire. Empires provided raw materials, markets, and security. So Japan began to copy the Western model of imperialism. Be strong like the West, they had to act like the West. From their perspective, this wasn't just pride. It was survival in a world of resource-hungry empires. And at first, it worked brilliantly. Japan defeated China in the First Sino-Japanese War of 1894–95. A decade later, it stunned the world by defeating a major European power in the Russo-Japanese War of 1904–5. These victories fueled intense nationalism and cemented the belief that Japan's destiny was to lead Asia. With each win, Japan acquired territories like Taiwan and Korea, satisfying some of its thirst for resources, but also setting it on a collision course with other world powers. The seeds of empire had been sown, and right alongside them, the seeds of a much bigger conflict. Then came the 1930s and the Great Depression. Japan's export-driven economy was hit hard. As economic pain grew, the political mood in Japan turned radical. Civilian politicians were seen as weak, and an aggressive, ultra-nationalist military faction gained more and more control of the government. These leaders saw territorial expansion not as an option, but as the only solution to Japan's economic problems. Their first big move came in 1931. Officers of Japan's Kwantung Army staged an incident in Manchuria, a resource-rich region in northeastern China, as a pretext to invade. They occupied the area and set up the puppet state of Manchukuo. This was a turning point. The international community condemned the action but did little else, sending a clear message to Tokyo's militarists. The path of conquest was open. Emboldened, the military pushed further. In 1937, a skirmish near Beijing exploded into a full-scale invasion of China. Tokyo expected a quick, decisive war to secure its dominance and solve its resource problem. They were wrong. Instead of a swift victory, Japan was bogged down in a brutal, unwinnable quagmire. The Chinese, under Chiang Kai-shek, refused to surrender. The war became a black hole for Japanese men and resources. It was marked by extreme brutality, with policies like the 3 alls policy: kill all, burn all, loot all, which only stiffened Chinese resistance. Instead of solving Japan's problems, the war in China made them infinitely worse, draining the nation's treasury and military. To keep the war going, Japan needed more oil for its ships and planes, more steel for its weapons, and more rubber for its vehicles. This desperation pushed them to look south towards the resource-rich European colonies in Southeast Asia. All this time, an officially isolationist United States was sending money and military supplies to the Chinese resistance. For Japan, America was no longer a neutral bystander. It was actively working against their imperial ambitions. The unquenchable thirst that drove Japan into China was now creating a much more dangerous problem: a direct confrontation with the United States. As Japan was mired in China, war ignited in Europe. Hitler's Germany was on the march. For Tokyo's military leaders, Germany's victories in 1939 and 1940 were a golden opportunity. With the European colonial powers Britain, France, and the Netherlands reeling, their colonies in Southeast Asia looked vulnerable. These colonies were rich with the oil, rubber, and tin that Japan desperately needed. In September 1940, Japan made a fateful choice. It joined Germany and Italy in the Tripartite Pact, creating the Axis powers. From Japan's view, this was a brilliant strategic move. They believed it would intimidate the United States and stop it from meddling in Asia. The threat of a Toshin war against Japan in the Pacific and Germany in the Atlantic would surely paralyze America. But the calculation backfired completely. Washington didn't see the pact as a reason to back down. President Franklin D. Roosevelt saw it as proof that Japan was part of a global campaign of aggression. The threats in Europe and Asia were now fused into one crisis for the Western democracies, and America's isolationism began to crumble. Roosevelt took more forceful steps. He moved the U.S. Pacific Fleet from San Diego to Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. Deliberate strategic message meant to make Japan think twice. The U.S. also started applying economic pressure after Japan occupied northern French Indochina in 1940. The Roosevelt administration responded with an embargo on scrap iron and steel exports to Japan. These weren't crippling sanctions yet, but they were a clear warning shot. The United States was flexing its economic muscle, targeting key materials for Japan's war machine. The very alliance that was supposed to secure Japan's empire was now helping pave the road to a showdown with its biggest rival. The year 1941 was the boiling point. In July, Japanese forces moved into southern French Indochina, aiming to cut off supplies to China and seize bases for future invasions of Southeast Asia. For the Roosevelt administration, this was a red line. It was a clear act of aggression that threatened British Malaya and the oil-rich Dutch East Indies. The American response was swift and devastating. On July 26, 1941, Roosevelt signed an executive order freezing all Japanese assets in the United States. Britain and the Netherlands did the same. This effectively halted all trade. A few days later, on August 1st, the U.S. announced a full embargo on oil exports to Japan. This was more than a sanction. It was a declaration of economic war. Japan was a nation that ran on imported oil, getting about 80% of it from the United States. With the stroke of a pen, the U.S. had cut off the lifeblood of the Japanese war machine. Its navy, air force, and armies in China would grind to a halt. The military estimated it had only enough oil reserves to last a year, maybe 18 months at most. The news hit Tokyo like a bombshell. The oil embargo presented Japan's leaders with an existential choice. Caught in an economic chokehold, the clock was ticking as their oil reserves dwindled daily. They could either give in to America's demands, pulling out of China and abandoning their imperial dreams, or they could seize the resources they needed by force. For hardline military leaders like Prime Minister Hideki Tojo, retreat was not an option. It would mean national humiliation. The economic strangulation didn't force negotiation. It bred desperation and convinced them war was the only path to survival. The final countdown had begun. In the frantic final months of 1941, diplomacy played out in Washington while the gears of war turned. Japan sent envoy Saburo Kurusu to join Ambassador Kichizubura Nomura in a last-ditch effort. But the two nations were too far apart. Japan's proposal was simple. It would pull troops from southern Indochina if the U.S. resumed oil shipments and stopped helping China. Essentially, Japan asked America to fund its ongoing war. For the United States, this was a non-starter. Secretary of State Cordell Hull saw it as a demand to accept Japanese aggression. But the American position was firm. For the United States, this was a non-starter. Secretary of State Cordell Hull saw it as a demand to accept Japanese aggression. But the American position was firm. Japan had to withdraw from its conquests. On November 26, 1941, Hull delivered the American response, which became known as the Hull Note. The note was a full list of American demands. It called for Japan to withdraw all military forces from both China and Indochina and to effectively abandon its Axis alliance. In exchange, the U.S. would lift the oil embargo. When the Hull Note reached Tokyo, it was seen as an ultimatum. Prime Minister Tojo told his cabinet, "This is an ultimatum." From their perspective, America was demanding Japan give up everything it had fought for. Its empire, its resources, its status as a great power. To accept these terms would be a national humiliation and political suicide. Honor, a powerful force in Japanese military culture, demanded they not surrender. The choice was now brutally simple. Accept the Hull Note and face national disgrace. Or go to war to seize the oil fields of Southeast Asia. For the military leaders in charge, there was no real choice. War, as great a gamble as it was, seemed the only honorable way out. Unbeknownst to the American diplomats, as Hull was handing his note to the Japanese ambassadors, a massive Japanese naval task force had already secretly sailed from the Kuril Islands, its destination, Pearl Harbor. At the time for talk was over. With war a certainty, Japan's military planners had to decide how to fight. The main objective was the Southern Operation, a massive invasion to seize the resource-rich lands of Southeast Asia, the Philippines, British Malaya, and most importantly, the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies. But one giant obstacle stood in their way: the U.S. Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor. Japanese leaders knew any move south would trigger an American response. They couldn't risk their invasion fleets being cut off by American warships. Pacific Fleet had to be neutralized. This brings us to Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of Japan's combined fleet. Yamamoto was complex. Having served in Washington, he knew America's incredible industrial power. He had no illusions about winning a long war, famously warning, "I shall run wild for the first 6 months or a year, but I have utterly no confidence for the second or third years." He knew if the war dragged on, America's production capacity would crush Japan. Therefore, the point of attacking Pearl Harbor was not to conquer the United States. It was a calculated, preemptive strike to cripple the U.S. Pacific Fleet for a short, decisive period. Yamamoto's plan was to land a knockout blow that would buy Japan 6 months to a year to conquer Southeast Asia. In that time, Japan would secure its resources, build a fortified defensive perimeter across the Pacific, and then, they hoped, a demoralized America would be forced to negotiate a peace that left Japan in control of its new empire. It was a colossal gamble based on breaking American morale with one devastating attack. The plan was meticulously crafted. Inspired by the 1940 British raid on Toronto, Japan secretly developed new torpedoes with wooden fins, specifically for the shallow waters of Pearl Harbor. A strike force of 6 aircraft carriers, the Kido Butai, was assembled in total secrecy. On November 26th, this fleet slipped out of a remote bay and began its silent journey across the North Pacific. The sword was unsheathed, pointed at the heart of American naval power. At 6 a.m. on December 7, 1941, 230 miles north of Oahu, the first wave of 183 Japanese aircraft took off. They approached from the north, their arrival aided by American blunders, including a dismissed radar report. The surprise was total. 7:55 a.m., the first bombs fell on the primary targets. The battleships on Battleship Row and the planes parked wingtip on the airfields. A second wave followed, bringing the total number of attacking aircraft to 353. The destruction was catastrophic. The USS Arizona's forward magazine was hit, causing a massive explosion that killed 1,177 crewmen instantly as the ship sank. The USS Oklahoma capsized after multiple torpedo hits, trapping hundreds inside. In all, 8 battleships were sunk or badly damaged, over 180 aircraft were destroyed, and 2,403 Americans were killed. By contrast, Japan lost only 29 planes. Tactically, the attack was a stunning success. Hours later, Japan launched coordinated attacks across the Pacific, beginning its sweep of Southeast Asia. But strategically, the attack was a monumental failure. First, the 3 American aircraft carriers of the Pacific Fleet were at sea and escaped the attack completely. In the coming war, carriers, not battleships, would be the decisive weapon. Second, the attackers failed to target the base's critical infrastructure. Its huge oil depots, repair facilities, and submarine base. This allowed Pearl Harbor to remain a functioning forward base, enabling the U.S. Navy to fight back much sooner than expected. But the biggest miscalculation was psychological, instead of shattering American morale. The Day of Infamy united a divided and isolationist country in a shared sense of outrage. The surprise attack, meant to secure an empire, instead awoke a sleeping giant and filled him with a terrible resolve. It guaranteed a war of total retribution that Japan could never win. Understanding the why behind moments like Pearl Harbor is key to grasping the forces that shape our world. This was a story not just of aggression, but of economic desperation, imperial ambition, and catastrophic miscalculation. If you found this look into the real causes of the attack valuable, make sure you subscribe and ring the bell. We unravel the complex why behind history's biggest events every week. Let us know in the comments. What other historical event's real story do you want us to uncover? The smoke over Pearl Harbor eventually cleared, but the fires it lit engulfed the planet. The attack wasn't the beginning of the story, but the explosive climax of a drama building for nearly a century. It was the final, desperate act of a nation caught in a trap of its own making. Japan's journey began with a fear of Western domination, which sparked a miraculous modernization. But that modernization created a fatal dependency on resources it didn't have. This led to a campaign of imperial conquest, copying the very model the Western powers had created. That conquest, especially the quagmire in China, drained Japan's strength and made it even more desperate. When the United States finally struck back with the ultimate economic weapon, an oil embargo, it left Japan's leaders with a choice between 2 forms of destruction: a slow, humiliating economic collapse, or a quick, violent gamble for survival. They chose the gamble. The attack on Pearl Harbor was a brilliant tactical operation born from a disastrous strategic mistake. It guaranteed a conflict that would lead to the total ruin of the very empire they fought so hard to build. The path to war is often paved with decisions that, at the time, feel like the only ones you can make, leading nations to roll the dice in gambles that change the world forever.